There's nothing I love more than authenticity, which is why I'm so excited about Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce, which has been on kitchen tables in Mexico since 1956. It will be available here in the US for purchase later this year. In addition to livening up your food, it's Mexican-owned, it's woman-owned, and it's one of the only hot sauce brands to have 100% Mexican-sourced pepper mix. Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce will be available here in the United States to purchase on shelves later this year. Hey there, I'm Lezli Levine-Harvell. Welcome to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. I believe the best way to explore a topic in depth is to view it through multiple lenses. Join us as we explore race, culture, and societal issues through the lens of industry experts, writers, cultural critics, and HBCU students. Hi, family. It's Lezli. It's our third deep dive on our topic named Hamburgers and Hot Dogs Are German. You know that, right? Well, we're exploring the word ethnic as coded language, immigration, and who gets to be fully American. We kicked off this topic 2 weeks ago by exploring whiteness in the nascent United States, the pathway to full card-carrying whiteness for particular European immigrant groups, and white ethnic revival during the Civil Rights Movement. Given that race is a social construct, last week we explored how that construct evolved in the U.S. during the wave of immigration facilitated by the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965, which brought in a wave of immigrants of color. If you haven't listened to those episodes, please go back because they're central to the discussion that we're going to have today about the word that sounds like nails on a chalkboard. That's right, ethnic. This word should actually be used generally to describe a cultural group, but it's almost exclusively and selectively used to describe food, seasonings, and people that are non-white immigrants. Ethnic is definitely a big one, and there are other coded language as well as behavior that is used to reinforce whiteness as a default and everything else is other. So I'm excited to explore the word ethnic, coded language, and behavior with Dr. Salvador Vidal-Ortiz. Salvador is an associate professor of sociology, as well as in the Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies at American University. He co-authored Race and Sexuality, and he co-edited The Sexuality of Migration, Border Crossings, and Mexican Immigrant Men. And he's currently working on a manuscript on Santeria, Race, Gender, and Sexuality, and a handbook on gender, sexuality, and migration. You are busy. Hi, Salvador. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Salvador, you wrote an opinion piece called How to Dismantle the Workings of Whiteness and Redistribute Power in Academia. You said there is a hierarchy in academia where the white faculty members teach required courses, which sends students a message about the field. And you also say when establishing teaching schedules, institutions almost automatically assign topics such as race and ethnicity to non-white faculty. And you said that it absolves white faculty members of having to teach something people already see as quote unquote subjective while assigning this imagined proper place to faculty of color. So I'm hearing a couple of things. White people teach the important material and the faculty members of color are teaching the unimportant material. The subtext in that statement is that there's already a presumption of what's important and what isn't important. So going back to Jeffrey Wasserson's statement of how asymmetries of power are created whenever only certain people are described as having an ethnicity, you spoke about minoritized subjects. I would love for you to share how academia reinforces the idea that certain material is foundational and other material is ethnicized.
Absolutely. It's very exciting to actually talk about this because your work focuses so much on food and the value and ethnicity related to foods. I think of some of the courses that I was mentioning in that column as ethnic courses, right? These are the courses that are offered in minority sessions or in a collaborative that focuses on race, gender, sexuality. So they mark the courses as distinctively otherized. You may have US history, but then you'll have Black history in the US.
As if they're two different things.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So that's where we get into trouble because we create a canon and a kind of hegemonic center that then defines These other things are sprinkles, right? They look nice, they add flavor, but they don't really understand or they don't really appreciate how all of those distinctive components are actually an inherent component of history as well.
I like how you called it seasoning. I like that you called it seasoning. Also, central to your point about non-white faculty always being assigned to teach minoritized topics, this is also a trope that we see often in books, film, and TV, that all non-white characters are either foreign or their arc centers on their ethnicity or race. For example, I'm not sure if you watch the Disney Channel, but I have 3 small girls, and there's a show on the Disney Channel named Bunk'd. And it's a spinoff of a show named Jessie that first aired in 2011. There's a character named Nina Lou. Her mother is super demanding, and Nina also plays the violin. And then there's another character named Ravi, who was originally on Jessie. So he started in 2011. He's good in math. He's socially awkward. He has a very thick Indian accent, although he was raised in New York City. Obviously, I think that academia is cultivating all of these amazing minds, right, who go off and write for TV and do marketing and things like that. I would like to know, in your opinion, because you write a lot about this, how can academia move away from framing all things Western as the foundation for students' knowledge of everything?
I think there's a way in which we have established women and gender studies, Latin American studies, US Latino studies, Black studies, or Africana studies as these studies that are supplemental, right? We never think of the strong humanities arts foundation that may have ethnic studies or gender and sexuality studies or racialized studies as foundational to the education of a student. So that's part of the challenge, right? A part of it would be we have moved through some progress to actually have some of these curricula recognized. What we need to do in some ways is at some point just make that curricula part of everything we teach so that we're not saying, here's the courses or here's the week on race, here's the week on gender, right? Here's the week on migration. We're saying all of the studies are actually constitutive of all of these different elements.
It's canon. It's
everything is canon. But part of
Yes.
the problem is that you have the others together, right? So you literally put all of the and I'm using quotation marks, non-foundational units together in order to give them more strength because they're competing for resources.
So I imagine this is playing out at a lot of predominantly white institutions. What is the path to change? Like, is that the department chair saying, I believe that Latin American studies, African American studies should not necessarily be this separate section? Like, does it come from the head and then the head is advocating on behalf of this? And what should students be asking for? How can they help to actuate change?
Those are great questions. In a way, it really depends on how the students formulate the questions. And it depends also on students' demands. If students say, we need these studies to be available and to be considered as foundational as everything else, then they will be constituted and recognized as such. And thank you for asking me that question because it actually reminds me of a point I wanted to share, which is ethnic and racial studies do not exist because academics sat down with activists and community members and said, what do you need? All right, we'll make that happen, right? It actually happened because we had activist groups. So one of the things that happened in the 60s and 70s was that organizations such as the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, which represented a lot of Puerto Ricans in New York, also the Brown Berets in the Southwest, which represented a lot of Chicano and Mexican American people, actually fought to have what we now understand as ethnic studies. In New York, they named specifically Black and Puerto Rican studies. They took over City College of New York as a college in order to demand and to have those demands be taken seriously, right? So it was through revolutionary practices that these projects emerged. It's not going to happen in 2020 because the chair of a department says we're going to change our curricula.
Got it. The revolution needs to continue.
It needs to continue. And in some ways, people need to know that history in order to be able to pick up where they left off. Part of what ends up happening is that people, and in some ways, the topic of the ethnic is contrasted to the racial. In many ways, ethnic tends to be a term that seems to be very innocent to people, right? If we say race, then either we get defensive if we're white, or we talk about the experiences with racism and discrimination that we have if we're not white. But when you say ethnic, it gets a little bit blurrier because we have a history, as you were saying earlier, where you have Italian Americans that were and in some ways are still recognized as groups that have a kind of ethnic national distinctive stamp, right? Whether it is the food, whether it is assumptions about their culture. So ethnic is a little bit more permeable. It still carries power, but it doesn't name race directly. So it's not as threatening.
Well, I think when people are using it, they may think it's not as threatening, but it's actually serving the opposite purpose.
Absolutely. When people say ethnic, it's such a coded term that they actually mean a myriad of signifiers. We have different meanings. We have different interpretations for that. And the problem is, I don't know when we're having a conversation what the meaning of ethnic for you is.
When they're talking about ethnic, they're not talking about Polish communities. They're exclusively talking about communities of color that are immigrants. And people of color are not the only immigrant groups here. So if the term was used generally, then it wouldn't be an issue.
Yes, there is more freedom when people use ethnic to not want to be interpreted as, oh, I'm not being racist, right? Nobody's saying the word race. Saying the word race would put us in a different kind of conversation that seems to be uncomfortable or threatening, or I may get defensive if we start talking about race, if I'm not prepared to talk about it, if I don't trust the person. But ethnic becomes a little bit like a gray area in between. So that
like exotic.
Like exotic. And so people are able to say things that they wouldn't say if they were saying immigrant, if they were saying black, right?
They're using it as a euphemism. Yes. You have so much in your bio. I was like, I'm going to ask him all the things when I talk to him. So thank you for sharing what students should be doing, what they should be asking of their universities, and the knowledge that they should have in terms of understanding how a lot of these courses even got there in the first place. One of the things we've explored over the past 2 Mondays is that as the US became more diverse, they began to play around with, okay, now these people are white. Okay, now we're going to other these people, because it shifted as the country became more diverse. And so we know that race, it just means social hierarchy. For example, originally in this country, Anglo-Saxons were at the top. And then you had these other white groups. They're all white, but there was this hierarchy by ethnicizing these other groups, right? I want to kind of touch on that a little bit as it relates to other groups that I think that you have a lot of knowledge on, is talking about in ways that you see this intra-hierarchy in other communities. So in August of 2019, Paper Magazine published a short piece by Monroe Bergdorf, who is an activist and model. It was called Monroe Bergdorf Reflects on the Toxic LGBTQ Hierarchy. She posted an Instagram about she was highlighting the violence committed by cis men against Black trans women, and she says it continues to be ignored. This activist, she said that it is like a symptom of whiteness, this issue that's happening, and that there's a hierarchy that is not being addressed. So I would love to just chat with you more about coded language and behavior that's used to create intra-hierarchy within the LGBT community.
So I'm always interested in trans-specific studies, which is part of what I've been doing for decades now, because it is the group that is least invested on when it comes to LGBTQ politics. So you often have cisgender, meaning non-trans people, who are in positions of leadership. And it's usually gender conforming, male presenting, male identifying men, usually white. I think in some of the politics, the national organizations here in Washington, D.C., that's shifting. But in general, it tends to be gay men, the ones that lead, and usually white gay men.
Whenever there's a hierarchy, whiteness is central to it, right?
So that permeates in terms of the resources and the mobilization around services for lesbian, for bisexual people who are often made invisible in the movement, and for trans people. So within that, you have gay men setting the agenda. And then in many ways, lesbian, bi, and trans communities resisting, pushing back, trying to influence that agenda. And trans people are often evoked as the victims of homophobia and transphobia, but not given leadership positions. And that gets even more complicated.
So then they're tokenized.
Oftentimes, absolutely. And if they're trans of color, even more.
And then obviously the racial nuance is going to mirror the same racial hierarchy that exists within the United States.
Yes, yes. So you have a lot of time that gets invested in thinking about the micropolitics of that group, the inside dynamics of the group. You also have then the ethno-racial axis. And I always think about media and the production of race and ethnicity in LGBT movies. So if we think, for instance, about the movie about Stonewall and the throwing of the first stone, Stonewall, as it was created 3-4 years ago, was actually based on the story of a cisgender gay white man as the person who threw the stone the first time. So the story in the movie actually is about him as the center of the movement. And you have people like Marsha P. Johnson, who was African American, and then Sylvia Rivera, who was Puerto Rican, Venezuelan, and Italian. The two of them were the ones that were engaged. There's different accounts in history about how much they were engaged, but they were there. The director, when he was interviewed, he said, I wanted the story to be relatable. So he used a cisgender white gay man to tell the story that he thought was universal. And that's a great example of how a lot of that universal versus the particular, it's like a pie that gets sliced, right? Oh, well, I'm actually not going to talk about those complexities because people won't understand it. And so we recreate history. The same thing happened in a documentary on Harvey Milk. One of the boyfriends Harvey Milk has is a Mexican younger man, and he drinks, he is emotionally unstable, they break up, he's very dramatic in many ways, right? And when I saw that movie, the portrayal of the Mexican American was completely juxtaposed against all of the other white people as a very different persona. So there are ways in which the ethno-racial gets marked as different, implicitly as less than. People may not say openly that that's what they're doing, right? But it's sometimes an effect of how we imagine the communities. So those hierarchies are at play, and I think they're both about gender and sexuality, and there's complexities within that relationship of gender and sexuality. And then in terms of race and ethnicity.
More impolite conversation in just a moment. HBO's latest documentary, Stockton on My Mind, is the multi-layered story of millennial mayor Michael Tubbs, whose own experience growing up in poverty and violence inspired him to create innovative change in his hometown of Stockton, California. Becoming the city's youngest and first African-American mayor, the film follows Tubbs as he defies expectations and makes efforts to reverse the fortunes of a city known as one of the poorest, most violent, and least literate in the nation. Directed by Emmy winner Mark Levin, stream it now on HBO Max. Visit hbomax.com to sign up for your 7-day free trial. So this isn't exactly central to coded language, but the reason that I thought it was interesting is because of a conversation that you and I had. And I wanted to learn more about this because I didn't even realize there was pushback on the word Latinx. And the reason that I bring it up is because a lot of what I saw the pushback being was the idea that it's centered in whiteness. So in December, The Atlantic published an article named Why Latinx Can't Catch On. James McWhorter says, African American came into vogue because it felt useful to a critical mass of Black people. Black could be interpreted as negative. Plus, Black as the English language successor to Negro, the Portuguese word for Black had been imposed from without by slave masters. African American was created from within and worked as a linguistic cousin to the embrace of Africa as Black America's mother continent. Latino was enthusiastically taken up as an alternative to Hispanic around the same time as African American. And then the newer term solved the problem created by the fact that Hispanic, which centers language, refers to Spanish speakers and thus excludes people of Brazilian descent. Latinx, too, purports to solve a problem, that of implied gender. For Black people, African American felt like a response to discrimination from outsiders. It was something that Black people felt that they needed as an alternative to the loaded word Black. The term serves as a proud statement to a racist society. He goes on to say, to Latinos, Latinx may feel like an imposition from outsiders by activists. We actually didn't mention this, but you're Puerto Rican, correct?
Yes, I am.
So in Spanish, some nouns are male. I'm speaking to you like you're in the first grade right now, but in Spanish, some nouns are male, el auto for the car. Some nouns are female, la playa for the beach. And it makes the conjugating of words difficult. Amigos becomes amiguex. As I was trying to understand what the pushback was, it seems like people who are pushing back against it is that English speakers are trying to impose their linguistic norms on Spanish speakers, and that if somebody doesn't have a working knowledge of English, then the word Latinx becomes incomprehensible. I'd love for you to talk about this.
Absolutely. There's a big distinction between a regional use of Latinx, and I'll get into that in a second, and then the linguistic implications. One, in terms of the regional use, oftentimes these discussions that I see online are about people thinking that Latinx is a term that has been invented in the US to be used against or for people who are Latin American, whether they're in the US or they live in Latin America.
Oh, they thought that it was like expat?
Yes. So if we say Latino and Latina, which refer to Latino is a generic term, but obviously it erases women, not according to the Real Academia de la Lengua Española, which is the Academy of Spanish language that actually assigns and reviews terms and then approves terms, right? Latinx is a term that they've had a lot of trouble with because Spanish, as you said, is gendered. And so if I'm going to talk about my male friend, I say mi amigo. If I'm going to talk about my female friend, I say mi amiga. There's a distinction in that second point between what it means to have a language that's gendered and then a language that's sexist. There's a distinction. The language used can be sexist. If I say to a group of 5 women, you guys, I'm using language that isn't understood as gendered in a very, very sexist way. Why would I say you guys if everyone else that I'm talking to is a woman, right? So just because a language is gendered does not mean that the language will be used in a sexist fashion. And sometimes people make the leap. Oh, well, the language is gendered, therefore it's going to create sexist practices. Not necessarily. But one of the things that happens is that in the US, referring to US Latina, Latino communities, people have started to use the term Latinx, not to refer to people who are using it in Spanish in Latin America. There's, of course, people who speak Spanish who are Latinx in the US. But one of the things that people imagine when they think about Latinas, Latinos, Latinx people in the US is that the majority of us are immigrants, right? And that the majority of us are undocumented immigrants. And the fact of the matter is that it's roughly half and half. So we've had Mexican Americans primarily, which have had second, third, fourth generation, even more. Those generations have been born in the US. Puerto Ricans, we've been coming to the US, or the US came to us over 100 years. So there's generations of Puerto Ricans. The same with Cuban Americans. We've had generations of Cuban Americans coming to the US. And those are the 3 numerically largest groups historically in the US. Now we have Salvadorians, we have Nicaraguans, we have Venezuelans, Colombians, Argentinians who remain in the US and have generations of family. They become US Latino. They're not Latin American because they're not immigrants. That distinction is often either unknown or ignored, and I don't think it's intentional, by people who hear terms referring to Latino communities. And so in Latin America, a lot of people, when they use Spanish, they don't use the X, they use the E or the E, the letter E.
You brought up the E. I thought this was really interesting because as I was reading some of the arguments in terms of from a linguistic standpoint, I was like, well, but still non-binary people do need a word. I found this really cute cartoon that I sent you that was published in Vox. Terry Blas, he created a comic where he says that he actually thinks that Latine, am I pronouncing it right with the E?
Latine.
Latine?
Latine.
Latine is actually going to become the word that is used for the non-binary community because he said it follows the natural flow of Spanish. Linguistically, he said that he was watching in the cartoon, it's the cutest cartoon. He said he was watching a Mexican drag competition on YouTube called La Más Draga. And he said that the host, Johnny Carmona, when he was welcoming the contestants, he used the words bienvenidos a todos, but he replaced every gendered vowel with an E. So he said
Bienvenidos, bienvenides.
Bien, yes, a todes. And he says it blew my mind. It was inclusive and easy to pronounce. It rolled off the tongue. And while Johnny has been criticized for using E, he said, I felt like he had given me a gift. He said, I like E. Amigos becomes amigues. Is amigues?
Or amigues.
Oh, amigues.
Because the U is silent in Spanish.
So he goes on to say, I'm not going to tell anybody to identify, but he was like, I identify as Latine. So I would love for you to continue talking about putting the E at the end of this. Based off of everything that I read, it seems like outside of the United States, that might become more popular.
Yes. So in Latin America, the X is not used to speak. Generally, it's not used. The E is, right? Because the E in Spanish makes it easier to actually name either a degendered group or an additional group. In Latin America, in Spanish, even in the US, if I use Spanish, I could say bienvenidas, referring to women, presuming it's cisgender women, bienvenidos, referring to men, again, presuming that it's cisgender men, and bienvenides. And then I'm including anyone who does not identify within the binary. That recognizes their identities. I could also simply say bienvenides, and that incorporates everyone. It's more comfortable, even though it's criticized, for certain groups of people to hear bienvenidas, bienvenidos, and bienvenides because they feel named. But bienvenides is supposed to create an opening. It's actually supposed to open. The E is supposed to be most welcoming. This is in Spanish in Latin America. In English in the US, the X is what's used. Because in English, if you say the X in Latin America, you would have to say Latin X. That's how you pronounce the X. So it doesn't even have the same translation in Spanish than in English. But in the US, we say Latinx. There are plenty of debates as to whether Latinx started in Latin America. There's actually scholars in Mexico who are doing empirical work, interviews.
Because I'm going to ask you, to me, I'm confused. Is the trans community outside of the United States, like in Latin America, are they already using the E? Are the non-binary people outside of the United States, Spanish speakers, are they already using the E? And then if that's the case, then I can get what the pushback would be. It's like it's trying to make Spanish conform to English norms.
That's where I think I would make the regional distinction, which is why I started with that one. If we're talking about Latin America, in Latin America, the X or the X is rarely used. It's the E. People who are thinking about trans people, including non-binary people and genderqueer people, you often use the E in places like Peru, Colombia, Argentina, and Mexico. So it's got some traction. It actually has been circulating. The E has. But the X, because it's presumed to be created in the US, and there's activists and scholars that have been writing about it, sort of looking at the origins of the term, if the X is related only to the US, then it's Latinx to refer to Latinx communities. So the X in the US may serve the very same principle or the very same goal than the E is serving in Latin America. The problem is that in the US, people keep relating to Spanish as if we were saying Latinx in Spanish, and I'm saying Latinx in English. If I were to say Latinx in Spanish, I would say Latinx because it's a letter, right? I'd be spelling the letter. And so it's very hard to actually say the X in Spanish and actually have a complete, meaningful sentence without interruptions, right? What becomes threatening to a lot of people in the US, particularly cisgender, straight males, is that if you say Latinx, they feel like they have been erased. And that's when they invoke this Spanish Academy of Language, right? That's supposed to approve linguistic practices and terms. That's when they say, but this is an imposition and it's colonizing. Well, Spanish is an imposition in the Americas and we speak it, right? There's no rhyme or reason to that logic.
Right, because language evolves.
Yes, and language it's supposed to be in movement so that we are comfortable naming ourselves. And that's the other point. There's a distinction between my identity and the identity of a group. It's less threatening if someone says, I'm Latinx, and harder for someone else to say, no, you're not Latinx, than if I say, we're all Latinx. If I say we're all Latinx, then people who don't identify outside of the binary, that is, people who are cis, who identify as male or female, may be very uncomfortable and say, no. You get to define yourself, but not me. And that's part of the tension with the term. But it gets sugar-coated around these linguistic practices and the purity of language in a way that's repetitive. I've heard it enough in like the last 3 or 4 years, and folks are not coming with new arguments. But there's a lot of resistance in the US. I'm not suggesting that the term is going to stick. For now, it is being used. There was a moment in the 90s where we used Latin at, because the at, the symbol of email, actually has an O and an A.
Oh.
So if you look at it, it has actually like the possibility of breeding both Latino and Latina. So in the 90s, Latin at was used. I think Latino was used at some point or proposed by someone. There are some scholars who think that we should go back to Latin, but it sounds a little bit early 20th century, like Latin people, like when they say the Spanish people in Harlem, there's no people from Spain. They're talking about Puerto Ricans. And so now Mexicans. Language does evolve, and some of these categories also evolve, right?
This is really interesting. All of the nuances around region in terms of Latinx communities in the United States versus like in Peru or Colombia. And then also understanding how you articulated coded language within the LGBTQ community. Obviously, the US is so diverse and has so many groups of people, but within that, there's always this hierarchy that happens. And it's just really interesting for someone like myself who does not necessarily know as much about the inner workings of the Latinx community, as well as the LGBTQ community.
In fact, I think one of the elements that's very important about what you just said, and why I appreciated at the beginning you mentioning how race is a social hierarchy, right? Is that we need to stop thinking of race as something biological. It has biological roots. People read me, you, and somebody who's of Asian descent in different ways. But if we read race as biology, then we make ethnicity something complicit and sort of like the other side of the coin. And ethnicity is also socially constructed, and it also creates a hierarchy. So, for instance, the US Census actually doesn't simply collect information on us as white non-Hispanic or black non-Hispanic. The US is actually creating those categories for us. We did not call ourselves Hispanics before the 60s or the 50s. The census created that, right? So sometimes we think of ethnicity as less innocent than race. But ethnicity carries a lot of the potential racial readings than race does. It's just sugar-coated. So that distinction is important. Because oftentimes we think, oh, well, I can't touch race because race is biological. No, race is read differently depending on the different countries and different historical periods, right? And that doesn't mean that if I'm a light-skinned Latino, I will not be followed on the stores. Actually, it has an implication. If I am light-skinned, I mean, I found it amusing the first time that I heard this. In English, we say someone has light skin as fair skin, you know?
Right.
That's very troublesome to me, right? It's like, what do you mean
right,
fair?
because fair actually means pretty.
Right. The language is already coded with meaning where notions of beauty are absolutely co-defined, co-constituted with whiteness. Those are the kind of formations in our everyday practice that we have to challenge.
That is such a good point. That is such a good point. The fair hair and the fair skin, right? Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was such a rich conversation. You have so much knowledge about so many different communities and groups. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I have one final question, and it is a fun one.
Okay.
So you know that the Iconoclast Dinner Experience, what it was rooted in and founded in, and we like to always ask all of our guests this one question. If it was your last night on Earth, where are you eating?
There's a great restaurant here in Washington, D.C. that serves Salvadorian food. And there's something called pupusas. It's a mass that actually has either meat or vegetables or cheese, and it's fried. It is one of the most wonderful meals. You can have 4 pupusas, and you could put like cream or sauce on top of it.
Amazing. I want one. If it's your last night, you can actually go to El Salvador.
I'm going to go to El Salvador, definitely.
Listeners, join us on Friday for our On the Yard episode where we'll be talking to 2 HBCU students about the reappropriation and reclaiming of words that were used to harm the LGBTQ community. Thank you for listening to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Icon Dinner and on the Iconoclast Dinner Experience Facebook page. Let us know what you thought about this episode. Hit us on socials or send us feedback at press@iconoclastdinner.com. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our podcast, and we'd also love it if you rated and reviewed us.